Welcome back. This is the final lecture video for week 1. In this video, we're talking a little bit about the Spanish Inquisition. Last video, we talked about some of the reasons why there was a need for a change, and I'll just mention this, but the combination of all those things, they work together to help create a setting in which the Reformation was successful as it was. Some of those developments did not exist in a wide degree during the time of John Wycliffe, and that helps explain why the Reformation didn't begin with Wycliffe, because some of those factors hadn't developed to their fullest potential yet until you get to the time of Martin Luther. So something to keep in mind at least. All right, now talk about the Spanish Inquisition. This is something I'm trying to fit into this section that we're talking about. But the word Inquisition, it's just like a prolonged period of intensive questioning. And we could call it an intensive process. We get the word inquiry, I believe, from the word Inquisition, which means to inquire, to question. All right, so when it comes to the history of the process of the Inquisition, it actually goes back pretty far. It goes back farther than the Spanish Inquisition. I believe you may read about this in the book. I have to go back and remember before I could make a definitive statement on that. But it actually begins in the 1100s as a way to combat heresy. Some of the popular movements, the Inquisition was used. We talked about the Waldensians, I believe, in the last semester. Sometimes the Inquisition was used to find out those that had taught the doctrines of the Waldensians and some of those other religious groups. It was in 1232 when it was officially recognized by the papacy, where Pope Gregory the Ninth, you don't have to get his name down there, but Pope Gregory the Ninth had commissioned a group of Dominican and Franciscan monks to begin this process of questioning when it came to heretics. Generally, if you were called into the Inquisition, you would be called in. There were generally a group of Dominican Franciscan monks who were friars. That's the name friar, F-R-A-R. A friar is somebody who is of the Dominican or the Franciscan orders. You'd have them, you'd have bishops, you'd have other church officials, and if you were called in, you would be asked a very intensive line of questioning based on what they would, based on the accuser and then the church officials there to judge you in the matter. This would be an important part of the Protestant Reformation because the Catholic Church is going to use the Inquisition not just in Spain but in other places to target some of the Protestant reformers. All right, so one thing about the Inquisition is that in a way it resembled the crusading spirit before. We've talked about the Crusades. They were simply military encounters that were launched against the opponents of Catholicism. We talked about that with, the first few Crusades that were targeted against what was called the Holy Lands, right? And how they were generally targeted at the Muslim residents there. But we also talked about that some Crusades were actually launched against the opponents of Christianity, or the opponents of Catholicism, like the Waldensians, like the followers of John Huss. The Pope had commissioned Crusades to attack them, that militant edge. So one thing about the crusading spirit is that it began to lose its fervor, it began to lose its effectiveness, especially by the 1500s. And again, that's where you go back to what was going on with the Ottoman Turks in Southeast Europe. what we say is Catholic Europe, but some of those regions were beginning to lose territory to the Ottoman Turks, who were the group of people that had ended the Byzantine Empire. If you go back and you look at the map, let me bring these points up and then we'll go look at the map. So in 1456, the European armies actually had got a pretty major victory in the city of Belgrade, which is in modern-day Serbia, over the Ottoman Turks, 1456 AD. And the end result of that is that the Ottomans were written off as saying this is the farthest they'll ever advance and we don't have to worry about that. Well, we've mentioned this earlier, that later on, by the 1500s, the Ottoman Turks invade and defeat an army of the Hungarians, which were connected to the right there on the border with the Holy Roman Empire, or Germany. The army of the Hungarians is defeated. The Pope calls for a crusade, but there's a lot of dysfunction about how this is to be handled. The crusade is ultimately unsuccessful. It's a pretty bad defeat for the Christian forces. And I'll go back and pull up the map of this to sort of point out some things about it. Again, 1453, they Ottoman Turks have captured Constantinople. They move farther to the west, and they move farther to the west. 1456 here's the city of Belgrade, which is again modern-day Serbia. Back up a little bit. The Ottomans are defeated there. They're quickly written off. And some of this territory had once belonged to the Byzantine Empire. But you see, this is where they're at by 1481. But if you note, we'll zoom out a little bit. If I can, may not be able to. There we go. You know, there's the legend there on the map. You see the acquisitions that are made. That obviously they make acquisitions. The Ottomans make acquisitions to the east and to the south. But they begin to make acquisitions into places where Catholicism had been present, primarily in Hungary. And again, you notice that the German Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, right there, its border is right there where the Ottoman Turks had been. And so the Hungarian armies had been defeated. They lost territory to the Ottoman Turks. The crusade that was called to try to win back its territory, it had ultimately failed. And so you've got two important outcomes that develop. Hang on, let me get my PowerPoint back situated. Yeah, okay, it was on that slide. I just had to keep going down. Right, so here are the two important outcomes from that we could point out. One is obviously that the Ottoman Empire is going to be a thorn in the side of the papacy, at least for the time being. For the next 200 years or so, the Ottomans are going to hold a continued presence right there on the southeastern border of the Holy Roman Empire. So you again have the question, can the papacy, can the church, Catholicism, can it effectively protect the Holy Roman Empire? Can it effectively protect Germany? That's one question that arises from that. Another question that's very important is that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, was much more concerned in his time about the Ottoman Turks continuing their advance possibly into Germany. He was more concerned about that than the reformers and the work of Luther in Germany. And Charles V was one who sided with Catholicism, but because he was more concerned with the Ottomans to the southeast, he didn't have the same amount of time to devote to suppressing Luther and some of these reformers in Germany. And so it leads to the question, maybe to the possibility, if Charles V had been more focused on if Charles V didn't have to worry about the Ottoman Turks, he might have been able to snuff out Luther and some of these reformers before they took off and made such headway and became very popular. So the crusading spirit, it starts to die away. It's not very effective anymore, except in Spain when it came to the Inquisition. And that's where we move to now. I'll mention that it was also effective in Portugal. And, Portugal, if you look on a map, Portugal is right there connected to Spain. They both shared some of the same problems, but we're going to focus primarily on Spain itself. So one thing you want to keep in mind about Spain compared to the other nations of Europe is that it was unique because it had a large presence of Jews and Muslims in the area. In some ways, this might have provoked some leading church officials to say that there was a greater need for the Inquisition in this area. One of the things that was noted about Catholicism in Spain is that it generally had a militant edge because of how it handled the Jews and Muslims. We talked about before, but really from about 800 up to about 1500, there is a what's called the Reconquista, where Spain is trying, the Catholics in Spain are trying to regain Spain to be put in the hands of Christians rather than in the hands of Muslims. One characteristic, though, in Spain is that it was known for its anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is, again, the hatred, discrimination against the Jews. 1391, due to the preaching of some church leaders, there is a persecution that is launched against the Jews. About a third of the Jews were forced into converting to Christianity. There are about another third of Jews what is sort of assumed or speculated, or the numbers are thought to be about a third on each. A third were forced into conversion. It's thought that about a third of the Jews in Spain were also killed beginning over the next few years because of this wave of violence that begins in 1391. The Jews that converted to Christianity were often called New Christians. This was a way to denote these new converts versus the older culture of Christianity that had existed in Spain. And the old Christians, who were basically the Christians, the presence of Christianity that had always been there, they were naturally suspicious of some of these Jewish converts. They, at least at first, they questioned their loyalty in some ways, but over time, the new Christians, those that had come out of Judaism, began to gain power within the church, began to hold offices within the church. And in light of that, there were a group of older Christians that had come from that background that did not want that to happen. They were often the people that were new Christians that came out of Judaism. The old Christians would often accuse them of becoming Judaizers, or trying to get people to revert back to Judaism or the law of Moses. And so you had a lot of there were moments where you had violence between new and old Christians, those that had come out of Judaism versus those that had essentially been Christians for generations beforehand. So enter in Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. These two individuals who are married, they become the head of the modern nation of Spain. These are the individuals that okay Christopher Columbus to set sail and eventually discover the Americas. And we'll we'll talk more about that in the second half of class, the introduction of Christianity to the Americas. So Isabella at this time was trying to consolidate her rule in the kingdom of Castile by siding against the Judaizers. Let me go ahead and pull up a map, by the way, because in Spain you did not have, it wasn't unified, so there are a lot of different kingdoms that are mentioned, and so I want to try to pull up a map. Maybe this will work. Okay, yeah, here we go. Well, let me back up. See if we can get one. Okay, so one thing that you would note, is that, you know, down here in the blue, this is a map that shows you the development of Spain sort of over this time period. But you can sort of indicate the declining presence of the Muslim government in Spain over time. So 910, 1037, 1150, by really 1492, the Muslim presence where it had been great, 910, is pretty much removed. So Spain had several kingdoms, right? And so by the time you get to the era of Ferdinand and Isabella, is that you've got several kingdoms in Spain. You got the kingdom of Castile and primarily the kingdom of Aragon. Well, when both Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile are married, they are going to sort of unite Spain into one kingdom. And they're in the process of driving the Muslims out of Spain. Right, they're in the process of driving the Muslims out of Spain back into North Africa while this is going on. So Isabella's in the process of consolidating her rule. Her half-brother has died, and the biggest thing that kept her, the biggest obstacle to consolidating her rule, was the tension between the new and old Christians in that area. The older Christians had leveled some accusations against the Christians that had come out of Judaism, that these new Christians had murdered a Christian boy to perform a Jewish ritual. And the rumors were unfounded, but didn't stop people from believing them. It turned into an attack on some of these new Christians. Well, Isabella decides to side with the old Christians in the matter, and she launches an attack against the Judaizers. And that's where the Inquisition comes into play. Part of the process of the Inquisition was finding the heretics, either forcing them to repent or putting them to death. From 1481 to 1488, there were 700 Judaizers that were forced to be burned at the stake and killed. One of the things that was unique about this is that the Pope had allowed for the Inquisition to be placed under the authority not of the church in Spain, but under the King and Queen of Spain. So by the time that Ferdinand and Isabella had driven the Muslims out of Spain by about 1492, there's an ultimatum given to the Jews and Muslims in that area, and it was simply, you either are forced to convert or you are forced to leave the country. There were around 100,000 Spanish Jews that decided to leave the country. Some upwards of maybe even 200,000 Jews that had left the country. But in order to leave the country, you had to leave behind a lot of your possessions in light of that. So it was very costly to leave. Some did stay behind and were converted, but we'll talk about the means of conversion in a moment. The Muslims that were left in the nation, some were given the choice to leave, just like the Jews were. Most did. But because there were such a large number of Muslims that were leaving the area, the policy of the king and queen changed to where they prevented them from leaving the nation. And they instead forced everyone, Muslim and Jew, to be baptized. And even by the death of the king and queen of Spain, this process continued where those that were Muslims, those that were Jews, were forced into being baptized and forced into converting to Christianity while they remained in Spain. So when that comes to the legacy of the Spanish Inquisition, it's again one of the darkest moments in the history of Christianity. If anytime you study the history of Christianity, the Inquisition is often brought up. I mean, it's obviously not happening just in Spain, but it happens in other places. But Spain is sort of seen by some to be one of the worst areas where it was implemented. It's a dark moment in the history of Christianity, certainly connected to the legacy of Catholicism at the time. But the success, at least in terms of getting people to convert or to Christianity or to leave their positions, is successful, at least in that way, even though it's immoral. People are going to look at later on when Protestant reformers try to when Protestant reformers at least try to have an influence in Spain, the Catholic Church within Spain is going to use the Inquisition to snuff out Protestant reformers, and so it becomes very it has that importance. I'll say this too. You know, I didn't mention this in conjunction to it being one of the darker moments in the history of Christianity. Some of the forms of torture that were used to force conversion. You had sort of a pre-modern form of waterboarding that was used. They would take a person, they would lay them on their back, they put a cloth over them, pour water over their mouth while it was open, and eventually you would drown because you obviously can't breathe water. That was one way they used to force people to convert to Christianity. I think waterboarding, I'm pretty sure is something that's outlawed. I think in most countries today, in terms of using that in terms of interrogation. There was also a form of torture where people were suspended, they were tied up, and they had their limbs pulled apart to where they would pull out a socket to where they would even be ripped off if they did not convert or acknowledge the crimes that they had committed. This form of torture in some ways would be carried over when when Catholicism in particular is first introduced into the Americas. But again, at least at this time, while it's very immoral, while it's very gruesome, it was effective to get people to stop being Muslims and to stop practicing Judaism. And so the Catholic Church will use that on Protestant reformers once they are, not just in Spain, but in in a lot of areas of Europe. But when it came to the nation of Spain, the Protestant Reformation did not take off in Spain like it did in, say, Germany or England. And that's because the modern nation of Spain was being developed in conjunction with the spread of Catholicism in that region. Because we contrast Spain with, like, England, the modern nation of England developed at the same time that a lot of English people were growing distrustful in the office of the Pope because of the Pope's pro-French policies while the Pope had resided in France. In the nation of Spain, though, Spain is being consolidated. It's becoming a modern nation built on unifying the nation under Catholicism. And so the Protestant Reformation is not going to be as strong in Spain as it would be in other areas. And I think that's something interesting to think about. It helps explain, why is it in Germany Or why is it in England? Why is it in Switzerland where you see most progress being made? Well, it all goes back to the relationship between the government in that area and the government's relationship with Catholicism and with the Pope. And so that's important to keep in mind. This concludes the content for the lectures for week 1. Your quiz is going to be based solely off of the content of these lectures, so make sure you take notes as you're listening along. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.